Welcome everybody to the Chronicle Virtual Forum on Equity in Remote Education. I'm Goldie Blumenstick. I'm a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and I'll be your host today for this event. I'm really thrilled to have you all here today because I think this is a conversation that is one of the most crucially important ones that colleges could be having right now, particularly as more and more institutions find themselves shifting their plans from being on campus or being partly on campus to being more and more remote on campus. And so this is a conversation that's becoming relevant on every institution today. And we're so glad you could all join us here today. A few housekeeping details. For those of you who've been on our calls before, this isn't new to you. Please stay on mute. You'll be on mute the whole time and use the Q&A tab to ask your questions. Of course, we'll be recording the forum so you can watch it or listen to it afterwards and share it with colleagues. And if you have any technical issues during the forum, email connect@chronicle.com. And that's for the technical questions. If you have questions for me or the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. I also would really like to thank today's sponsor for today's forum, Microsoft. We can't do these events without the support of our sponsors, and we're really grateful for Microsoft for its backing on this project today. A few minutes into the conversation today, you'll hear from my colleague, Ian Wilhelm. Ian, by the way, is behind the scenes right now, pushing all the buttons, making this thing happen. And Mike Tolfson, who's the Principal Group Product Manager at Microsoft Education. They'll be having a conversation at about midpoint of our discussion here. And we're grateful for Mike for being with us as well today. Even more so than that, I'm really grateful for this terrific panel. I'll introduce them in a minute here. And the reason I'm going to do something this way because I think it's really relevant. Each of you, Allison, Enrique, Charles, and Sharon, you come at this with very relevant but very different perspectives. Allison as the president of a small liberal arts college, Enrique as an advocate for Latino students, Charles, a professor who studies issues of race and equity at University of Michigan, and Sharon, the provost at a historically Black institution, Spelman College. You all bring a unique perspective and also a generalist perspective to this conversation. And so I want to start out by asking each of you, and I guess we'll start with, I don't know who I should start with. Let's start with Sharon. As you've been thinking about this whole issue of equity in higher education and the challenges what has been the one thing that really sort of caught you by surprise as colleges made this shift in the fall from, on campus to remote? Obviously colleges think about equity issues all the time, but what was the thing that really caught you off, really surprised you about maybe the difficulties of doing this, or maybe even that it was easier to do it than you thought? So Sharon, why don't you start?
So thank you so much, Goldie. It's great to be a part of this conversation. And I would say that we learned so much from the spring when we pretty much within about a week's time had to shift all of our classes online, and our students had to empty the residence halls. And so it was a very challenging situation, but one of the first things that we did was we began to have these frequent, almost weekly surveys of our students to ask what they needed, to ask what the challenges were. And some of the things that they said, of course, were things that we expected. Like a number of them really didn't have the equipment that was necessary. Like laptops, we had to actually go into hyperdrive just to raise the funds and to put in their hands the tools that they needed to take their classes online. So that was kind of expected. Some other things that we thought would be challenges were issues of connectivity, because we're talking about equity today, and our students have inequitable access to the internet, and that was really a necessity for them to be able to be online learners. But I would say that the one thing that surprised me maybe the most is that our students, when responding to what they needed from us, said very frequently they needed quiet. They needed a space to focus. And they were back in their homes. And we all know that family households are places of energy and activity. And it occurred to me as I was reading through and listening to their responses was that colleges provide a sanctuary from that kind of family activity and have created spaces for our students to focus. And that was a very difficult thing to be able to give them from distance.
I would imagine almost impossible. Charles, as you observed what you saw happening on your campus and what you were hearing from your colleagues who study these issues, what was the one thing that sort of struck you? You know, we know things are inequitable in higher education, but when we switched to remote, what was the one thing that became kind of glaringly obvious that you hadn't thought about before?
So I think there were two main things. So one, I think the extent to which faculty were ready and prepared to make the online shift in terms of their instruction, particularly for classes that aren't perhaps best accommodated in an online interface. I was teaching a research methods course, and so in some ways it was easy to make some parts of the transition possible, but other things that we would do in person, like observational exercises and things of that nature, were made a bit more difficult because we weren't able to be in person and to do some of the sort of in-person observations that we typically do. But I think another thing that was also glaring, and this was not a phenomenon unique to USC where I was at the time, but really the extent to which white supremacy and racism were kind of excavated in this digital atmosphere, right? And so we heard a lot about Zoom bombings, where white supremacists would take over those virtual classrooms. And so much of this was interesting to me, in part because universities almost deferred to the notion that this was from outside agitators, right? But when we think about this different parameters that are set up for security purposes, although some more than others, and Zoom has improved on this, that white supremacy has to be living in some ways on our campus for folks to get access, right, to these classrooms. We know that alt-right and white supremacist groups are using students who are on campus currently to surveil faculty members like myself, to disrupt their classes in particular ways. And I think many faculty were not prepared to respond when those Zoom bombings took place. They didn't really know what to do in that moment. And in some ways, many folks experienced re-traumatization based on how those incidents were handled.
It's really interesting, especially thinking about the campus if you think about the campus as somewhat more of a sanctuary, which maybe it really isn't, but clearly when you switch to a remote environment, that changes quite a bit. Allison, from the perspective of the president's office at a small liberal arts college, what were the things that really, one or two things that really struck you?
Well, a moment ago, you used the term what was glaringly obvious. And I think it's true that this just sort of shone a spotlight on things that were always true and became even more visible in this moment, just as the COVID crisis has nationwide. It was really interesting to me to find that actually we were prepared for the idea that technology would be a source of inequity, and we were prepared to remedy that. That really seemed like the least of the problems. It wasn't that hard to mail hotspots and mail laptops. What was hard was recreating the kind of connections that are part of the campus when you realize that all of the things that normally take place behind the scenes, those channels are sort of lost. It made me think actually of Tony Jack's work in The Privileged Poor and his emphasis on the way in which the kind of social networking is part of what differentiates students with privilege from students without privilege. When there's no informal networking, suddenly everybody's just who are you actually connected with on social media, who is your actual friend group. Some people were left very isolated very quickly. And I think it was really, striking to see how the comments that Jack has made about how some students know how to approach professors, others don't, much more true in a remote world where things that might otherwise have been obvious, like well, if I don't understand how to do this, is it okay to ask the professor or do I ask ITS? Just kind of everyday questions that students who felt less comfortable in the environment might have trouble with. There are no friends to ask, there's no roommate to ask, you can't ask the kid next to you in class, you're just stuck alone. And we felt that it really created a lot of isolation on the part of some of our most marginalized students.
Okay, as we continue, we'll talk a little bit about techniques for bridging some of that. Enrique, you do a lot of advocacy work particularly for Latino students, and I imagine for Native American students as well. What was the thing that really struck you the most about sort of, the things that became glaringly more obvious about inequities in remote teaching?
Hi, thank you. Well, it's a mixed bag. For our students, as all working class, marginalized, disenfranchised students in general, the campus there's like a love-hate relationship. So it's similar to what was already said, that our students experience alienation and isolation. Many of them who are first generation, they're not familiar with this college-going culture. So just as they're being acculturated or socialized into this college-going culture, to a certain extent, there's a kind of a leveling effect or normalizing effect, where, I mean, if you don't have the support or the services or resources available to you in your kind of home environment, you're able to access certain services on campus. For example, our undocumented student success center, where there's like a third space or a safe space for our LGBTQ students. We have a veteran success center. Students have lunch together. They access the same classrooms, the same library resources, the same Wi-Fi. So you come to the point where you depend greatly on those resources for immediate feedback. Hey, I need to, who do I talk to about my financial aid? Those kinds of things. And then, so it's both alienating, isolating, but a part of the campus is really a refuge. It's a place to go where you can access resources. So all of a sudden that's taken away. So I think, as was mentioned already, we were in a triage situation. The number one thing was connectivity, right? So how do we make sure everybody has access to Wi-Fi spots? The next thing was, I guess you could call it device equity, where now everybody has the same devices. In many low-income students' households, not everybody has a cell phone, although it's quite common for people to have at least a cell phone. But if you can imagine, you're trying to access Blackboard, you're trying to access all these resources via, a small little device. And in some homes, you share the device with other people in your home, depending on the situation. And so all of a sudden you have to access the same resources. So the experience of going to college, that college going culture, being socialized, is not there. So the alienation, the isolation, it's the gap there, the learning gap, the opportunity gap gets widened.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned questions about financial aid and other things. Some of you may have seen a study that Ithaca and SNR did. They did some surveys of a bunch of colleges. I think actually Lafayette was one of the colleges, Allison, where they talked particularly about the issues that were raised by lower income students. And one of the things that they mentioned was concerns about, the disconnect to academic and financial aid advising, the problems doing group projects. Students who are caregivers identified a great deal more mental and physical stress because of the additional responsibilities they had at home, and the broader economic anxieties in general. And another thing that I thought was really interesting about this survey was, for the students who said they were planning to re-enroll, those were the ones who knew the most about what kind of services the campus were making available to them in the absence of not being on campus. So clearly outreach, the more colleges can communicate outreach to students about what they're doing, seems to make a difference. I think Ian is going to put a link to that survey in the chat or the Q&A, where people watching this can see it. Take a look at that whole study. I'm also going to ask Ian to post another document. Sean Harper, who some people on this call may know, actually I think Charles, you may have worked with Sean. He testified at Congress and talked a lot about some of the bigger issues that were affecting particularly low-income students, minority students, other disadvantaged students who were at colleges that were broadly affected by COVID, and he identified sort of 10 big issues, and we're going to just put that in the chat there as well, as just a kind of another good resource for people to have on this call. One of the things I sort of wondered about, you all talk about the role of the campus. What about supports and things like that? If you're losing some of these on-campus supports, what can colleges do, or what do they need to be doing to kind of recreate some of those in a remote environment? At this point, all of you are going to be, I think, remote in some form or another next fall. I'm not actually sure about Michigan, but everybody else. I guess I'm going to just direct this to the administrators on the panel about this one a little bit. Allison and then Sharon, are there some things that you could do to recreate some of those supports? Allison, go first.
I would say a lot of it comes down, you made the excellent point that often there are services that students don't know about. And one of the things we found was that there really was a need to have very individual outreach to specific students, to call them, not wait for them to contact services, but to find, who are the students who we think might be having difficulties and have someone reach out to them. In something as simple as at some point we realized that we would have to do a housing survey to find out, what students' plans were in terms of getting their stuff back. But we used that as an excuse to actually call every student personally and have a conversation just to kind of check in with them and find out how they were. So the overt purpose was, tell us, when you're going to come back and get your stuff. But people were also instructed to ask, how's it going? And do you have any challenges? Oh, do you know that you can actually talk to the Academic Resource Hub? And so we tried to use that as an opportunity to kind of proactively engage the students and find out what the challenges might be. Because I think we did find that, people were reluctant to reach out, and yet a lot of those services were available if people knew how to find them. And so making those connections more explicit, and also giving faculty advice about ways to create social connection around the classes, to realize that normally that happens just organically, but it doesn't otherwise. And so if you have a group project, you can't ask students to pick each other as group partners when they don't have any way of knowing each other. So, faculty started to get into the swing of realizing that they had to really do a little bit of matchmaking, or suggest things like, you all might want to share your, Instagram so that you can talk outside of class. Finding ways to build social connection around the courses that otherwise would happen naturally seemed like something that the administration and the faculty could play a role in doing in a slightly more structured way.
Sharon?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is for last spring and our efforts to keep our students plugged in. And plugged in over the summer, as well as getting them across the finish line last spring. It really took a lot of frequent high touch efforts that our faculty were engaged in. And I'll give you just one example over the summer. Is we had this incredible faculty-driven initiative at Spelman, where our faculty created data science research opportunities for our students over the summer. And we were able to provide some funding for our students, which is such a critical part of this conversation, Goldie, because our schools are not just educators for many of our students, they're employers of many of our students, and our students really rely on that. And so to be able to attract the funding that would allow us to keep our students researching, exploring areas like data science and in the areas of their discipline was one of the efforts that we made to keep our current students. But looking forward, in the fall, one area is the first years, the entering first years, who, as you know, Spelman has now made the decision that given the number of rising cases of COVID, we're not able to bring our students back in the fall. And so how do you introduce first years who have not yet bonded with each other, have not yet got plugged into those student groups that have such high quality retentive, power? Those are the questions that we are working on right now, because we know that they are going to require, as a cohort, interventions that we didn't necessarily need to focus on when all of our institutions went online in the spring.
I want to shift gears a little bit on this and go to talk a little bit more about the topic Allison raised, sort of teaching practices, and bring the two professors in, particularly on this one. I'm wondering about policies, about, are there some things that professors need to think differently about when they're teaching their classes, and that, not just from the classroom perspective, where institutional-wise they can be helped by that. Thinking about organized office hours. Should professors be asked to be thinking differently about how they do grading, or even how they organize kinds of assignments, maybe not do as many of these sort of group assignments? Is that practical for schools to be thinking of at an institutional level? And kind of, do professors need that sort of freedom to have to do some of that, or can they just do that on their own? Charles, what do you think? Oh, go ahead. Allison, go ahead. Sid first, if you have a thought on that.
I did. I was just going to mention that we were having a similar conversation on our campus, and it's difficult because faculty, of course, are used to having a degree of autonomy and they know what they're doing in the classroom. At the same time, these are new circumstances. We had actually a faculty committee draw up a set of guidelines that then the provost put out that said, things like be explicit about how to contact you online and when you're available. Be explicit about all the things you think you don't need to be explicit about. And while in some sense it seemed like very elementary instructions, we found that it was actually very, very helpful to have consistency across the faculty where all students were getting a similar message about how they could access their faculty members, how they were supposed to be looking at them as a resource. We realized there's a lot of hidden knowledge there that not everyone had. So it didn't seem inappropriate for the provost to actually share that with the faculty as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Charles, you had, when you and I were sort of getting ready for this conversation, you indicated some hesitations about some of these kinds of rules.
Sure. So I think part of the challenge, right, is whether leadership is demonstrated at various levels within a particular school or college or even at the university as a whole. And so as Allison mentioned, many faculty are used to having a certain degree of autonomy, and now having sort of prescriptions for how we all need to move forward is something that challenges a lot of faculty in their everyday practice. And so when I think about that in the context of what we should be doing, I think certainly availability is really important in this moment. I could say for myself that there was a huge increase of the extent to which I was interfacing one-on-one with students in my course, but part of that was made possible in that I set up an online system that would allow students to schedule time over the course of the week that was supplementing the lack of course interface time that we'd have, right? We're not going to spend 3 hours on Zoom every single time that we're supposed to meet, but we can supplement that with one-on-one instruction. Again, that was something I was familiar with, I was comfortable with, but it certainly sort of drove up the amount of time I'm spending per week on just this one particular class. And so in addition to that, I think one thing that is challenging for folks is this notion of grading and merit, right? So many of our institutions are really propped up on this notion of prestige and rigor, right, which have a lot of things underlying them and embedding them that disenfranchise students of color, women students, queer students as well. And many faculty were struggling with whether I grade something this semester. And if I do, how do I do that? Whereas other professors like myself were considering more pass-fail approaches to the learning process, really thinking about how do we adjust our learning outcomes that would be different than being measured just by these quantifiable things in terms of grades. And I think that's difficult in part because we're so committed to ranking and sorting students in this particular way that we're not open enough to think that learning looks different across different student populations, and whether a student gets an A or a C, they might actually come out with a different set of learnings depending on their familiarity with the topic ahead of time or what they've actually grown and learned over the course of the semester. And so I think grading is a particular thing we have to think differently about when, as my colleagues have mentioned, Enrique in particular, whether students have broadband access to the internet, whether their environment's quiet, whether they're now responsible in a more caretaking role for those who have older parents, right? These are things that we have to consider that I think K-12 is more ready to wrestle with, of what students are bringing with them into the classroom, given that the previous gap between classroom and community is now otherwise closed.
It's really a good, powerful point, because I think K-12 teachers are commonly thinking about this way, and professors are always like a little, well, they're here now, they should just deal with it, right? Deal with the world. Enrique, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of thoughts are coming through my mind right now. I think the number one thing as a faculty, as a professor, I want to connect with my students. I want to let them know I care for them. I want to know how they're doing. So the first thing I did is I simplified the curriculum. I said, let's get rid of all this stuff, which I didn't think was fluff, but now when I look at it, it's a lot of fluff. I need to get rid of this right away. And I simplified the curriculum. I used the Zoom classroom time. I took some time at the beginning to sort of do like a therapy session. How you doing? What's going on? And so by doing that, I learned a lot about my students who didn't know where to live. They had to scramble to find a place to live. Or many of them had to go back home with their parents to live. And of course, as was mentioned, there may be their little cousins or brothers and sisters running around. They don't have necessarily a space where they can concentrate and focus on their work. I offered them different grading. I basically said, look, everyone's going to start off with a clean slate. You tell me how you're going to show me that you learned something. So in a sense, I kind of gave up a lot of my control. I said, okay, really, learning is really what you put into it as a student, right? You have to read strategically, you have to write and be strategic about what is it that you're going to turn in. So I said, okay, you tell me what is it that you want to demonstrate that you that you learned what you're supposed to have learned, so that self-agency. And then I was very flexible in terms of my scheduling. I got rid of some assignments that normally I would say, okay, this is due week 4. I got rid of stuff.
Is it necessary to have like sort of permission from the institution to do some of that? I mean, how much or
I don't know. I've been a professor for a lot of years, and I just kind of like just take control. This is what I'm going to do. What I saw myself doing is I became, for lack of a better term, an equity counselor. Oftentimes on campus, we have a lot of on-campus resources and facilities, but what this pandemic really did is it forced us to work together. We were already working together, but to work even closer. So we need to cross-train. So the financial aid folks need to know what's going on in admissions and records. Those folks need to cross-train what's going on with the student success centers and those kinds of things. So because I'm a campus representative that's available to my student, they were asking me, hey, who do I talk to about this? What do I do about this? And so what it did is it forced me, I mean, I was already aware of many of these things, but it really forced me as a professor to learn more about the on-campus resources that were available to our students, because then I oftentimes became the only conduit to information. In the meantime, our campus was scrambling and everybody was trying to do stuff. People were having to move their equipment from their offices so they can work at home. You make a phone call to campus and nobody's answering the phone number. So people are asking me what's going on. So I try to best as I could, counsel them. I'm not a mental health provider, so I didn't counsel them on like their mental health issues, but I would most definitely say, okay, well, what about this? What about that? And I'd give them ideas. And I was very flexible.
I'm glad you mentioned this equity counselor notion, because I've been thinking about it a lot ever since you first mentioned the idea to me. It strikes me as an idea that, sort of a newer approach, an approach that colleges aren't taking right now, just, having somebody with that lens on. As we bring back Mike and Ian here for a minute to take a pause in the conversation, I'm wondering if when we finish, maybe I'm going to go back to you, Enrique, just for a minute when we come back, and you could talk a little bit more about what that role would be. And then I'm also going to ask Allison and Charles and Sharon, as they're thinking about this, are there some other sort of overarching positions that the universities need, a position or a strategy right now, maybe a strategy better than a position given the money situation, that would really help ensure equity in remote teaching as we kind of move forward over the next year? So why don't we all three of us take ourselves off camera for a minute here. I'm going to bring back Ian and Mike, and when we come back, we'll just explore this a little bit further.
Hey, thanks, Goldie. I appreciate it. It's been a really great conversation so far, and I want to bring in someone I will interview now. Is Mike Tolston with Microsoft Education. Mike, thanks for being here today, and also thanks to Microsoft for supporting this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we were talking beforehand a bit about looking at this issue of equity, which can be looked through so many different lenses, and obviously is a huge challenge. And beforehand, the panel side, we were all agreeing this is probably the biggest issue right now. It was a huge issue, obviously, before the pandemic hit, but now as we look at these different modalities of learning, these different ways of reaching folks, students, as we deal with unprecedented sort of uncertainty, you got to think about it in so many different ways. And the way that you were talking to me about, which I thought was interesting, was how do we make it effective, equitable in terms of accessibility for folks with learning disabilities, for folks who are hard of hearing, for folks who are non-native English speakers. That's obviously a key thing now. I'm kind of wondering what you're hearing from your partners in higher education, what you all are suggesting in terms of how you kind of think about this issue, as well as so many of the other ones that our panelists are raising.
Yeah, so some of the issues that you brought up are the top areas that I work on. So I'm on the Microsoft education team. I work on the product and engineering team. And Microsoft in general, our mission, and not everyone knows that, our mission from the last few years, but it's really useful in this, I think, forum today, is to empower every person on the planet to achieve more. And our education mission is to empower every student on the planet to achieve more. And what I always like to say is that doesn't mean empower 86% of the students. That doesn't mean empower 94.3% of the students. It empowers 100% of the students.
Right.
And so we really think deeply embedded in our mission is really about inclusion and accessibility in our tools as well. And so how do we build these things in natively into our tools? I like to say built-in, mainstream, non-stigmatizing, and free. And so with the pandemic, all of the challenges we're already talking about are true. And also, especially if you're a student, let's say you're a student with dyslexia. And dyslexia is estimated to impact up to 15% or more of the population. Or maybe you're a student at dysgraphia, ADHD, could be vision impairments, could be deaf or hard of hearing. It might be you're a non-native speaker, which is not a disability. It is just something that can be making it more difficult to communicate if maybe your professor doesn't speak the same language that you speak natively. And so all of those things are true before the pandemic, and then all those things are true during the pandemic. And it can make it incredibly difficult for some of those people to engage digitally without technology to help. And so what we think about is how can we help those different students still engage, still have equitable access to information, communication, understanding, with tools in many cases that are free and built in. They might not be aware, but that's the types of tools that I work on.
Well, that's the thing you mentioned to me I thought was interesting. And as you said, these challenges existed beforehand, and so many as we've dealt with in terms of inequities, they've just been exacerbated by the pandemic. But you also said to me, hey, I think you're suggesting there that some of these challenges can be overcome, that you may not be aware of, that some faculty members may not be aware of, hey, that some of these tools are already sort of available to them. And so maybe not be as hard a lift, I guess, to find ways to overcome some of these challenges for those different populations and some of those challenges you mentioned.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I realized in the very first part of the question, I would transition it into this. What we're hearing, so as part of Microsoft Education, we've got a higher education advisory board where we have a bunch of representatives from all around the country and the world that we meet with on a regular basis, and we always are trying to understand what is top of mind for these higher education leaders. And accessibility is right at the top consistently. It is like one of the top things, and this is pre-pandemic and during pandemic, one of the top things that higher ed institutions are trying to understand and figure out, because they don't feel all equipped to be able to help with that. And that helps with engagement and retention of students, right? If a student, you can engage and retain a student through whether it's dyslexia, or whether it's dysgraphia, or non-native speakers, or whether it's deaf and hard of hearing, there's various reasons, then that's a challenge. But to your point, what I've been working on, I work on something, for example, called the Immersive Reader, which is great for reading, or we have speech to text, or Microsoft has built-in real-time translation capabilities in 70 languages. And that's now integrated into PowerPoint, so you can engage and present. Imagine you're talking in English and it pushes it out in 70 different languages in real time that's captioned. And we have math capabilities. And a lot of people have the view, I've found, unfortunately, and it's all right, if you think of Microsoft from the year 2011, and in your head, you're kind of like, costs a lot of money, it's Windows only, and gosh, I haven't thought about in details in 9 years. Well, the modern Microsoft is, again, built-in, mainstream, non-stigmatizing, and free. So we work on all platforms. We work on Macs, we work on Chromebooks, we work in the browser, we work on iPads. And all these things I'm talking about are free. And so that's another thing where it's just a mind shift. During the pandemic, as an example, we've seen 10x increase in usage of the Immersive Reader, which is our inclusive reading tool. So there's just this massive availability of free and inclusive and assistive technology that a lot of people and students aren't necessarily aware of, that they could be using right now. And so a lot of this like to joke, like, we're not selling anything here. This is actually just trying to let people know that it's available and you can use it to be more accessible and inclusively engaged.
Yeah, and I think another thing you mentioned to me is that having all these conversations are probably happening on campus, that there's more of these conversations, and we've heard this elsewhere as well, that parts of the campus that traditionally felt siloed are now talking together. I think Enrique was even talking about, cross-training right now. There's a space here. Obviously, everyone's busy. I don't want to make it sound too easy, but there's a moment here to kind of talk, hey, how do we do this? And how do we make some of these things work when we're faculty members, talking with IT staff, talking with other staff who may know some of these tools better.
Yeah, and actually that's another area that I more recently have started working on, is sort of professional development and training, and how do different institutions ramp up and learn, right? No one's got just oodles of time to take a 4-day course and, kick back and learn end to end. Like those, if anything, that time has been radically compressed. I think as one of the panelists was talking about, like, you have to make decisions about what you keep in and what you keep out. So I would say a couple things. We do have online, we have free courses on our educator community, and these are short courses. It could be 60 minutes of just learning some simple tools. We've also started focusing on what I like to call quick tip videos. We found like the 2-minute video of how to use the inclusive engagement and real-time translation in PowerPoint web is great. I spend 3 minutes. I learned a tip that I could start using maybe in my lectures to engage non-native speakers at scale digitally. That's worth 3 minutes for a lot of people's time. Or maybe it's just I learn about how the new speech to text that's built into these different capabilities. It's watching these 2-minute videos. So that bite-size, simple focus has proven to be pretty popular. And then there's also on the IT side, that's a broader one. Usually IT folks maybe do spend a little more time if there's complexities, but some of it might be, hey, in our school, I need to work with IT to understand how we deployed these solutions at scale. Like sometimes the professor might say, well, I'd like to use it, but our IT person hasn't deployed that yet. So we do have more specific things for the sort of the IT engagement. But even there, the studies around the amount of money that can be saved deploying some of these technologies, where maybe before people spent a lot more money on expensive add-ons, and now these things are built into the platforms that they already had. So a school that just had big budget cuts due to various reasons that are happening right now, it might be that, oh, things that we thought we had to pay for in the past are now free and can just be pushed out at scale. So that's a different angle to think about as well.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate your conversation. I'll kick it back over to Goldie now and bring the other panelists in. But again, thanks for being here today. Thanks for raising the issues. Sure. Obviously, these are the issues I think the Chronicle will be exploring as well, because it could take be its own panel, if not its own longer series. But Mike, thanks very much, and thanks to Microsoft for supporting today.
Sure, thanks for having me. See ya.
Hey, Goldie, I'll kick it back to you and to the panelists. Thanks again to everybody for joining us.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate that. I want to pick up some really good questions in the Q&A, and we want to get to those quickly, but I just want to follow up with the Enrique, just maybe briefly, and then I'm going to ask all the rest of you the question. You had talked about this idea of a student equity counselor, and maybe that's not a position, maybe that's a philosophy or something, but maybe in a 30 seconds or so, could you just sort of tell us what that would be like?
Okay, well, I mean, equity, when we think of equity, it's really a disposition, right? And there's no one size fits all. So it's something you keep in mind when you're making decisions on classroom practices to campus-wide policies. So the number one thing is what we learned, obviously, this pandemic has been extremely disruptive in the lives of students, and particularly those of color and working class students, et cetera, et cetera. So the financial insecurity is very real, right? The damage to students' mental health is very real, and not just students, but other people who work on faculty and staff. Although the campuses have generally been very responsive, sometimes we tend to work in isolation or in silos, and so I use the example. I was calling my local branch the other day of a bank, and I couldn't get what I wanted. So they had a little chat room on their website, or I can call a 24-hour hotline, and right away somebody helped guide guided me. So the idea is these equity counselors, they can just kind of guide the student to where to get the information. I'm not an expert on the information, but I can tell you where to go get it. It replaces the old days where you'd have to walk around campus and you ask this person and they say, oh no, you need to go talk to that person. Then you go to talk to that person, and eventually you find the right person you need to talk to. So we need to simplify that and make it a way so that we can, one person can help navigate the person. The K-12s, we have a lot to learn from the K-12 because they have an idea of kind of a wraparound services where somebody can just guide you, maybe an information window, those kinds of things. And that helps with the uncertainty, because we know our students nationwide are facing the uncertainty and a profound, I say profound, sense of disconnection. And so they need to connect right away. And then that's something we can do right away. But then in terms of equity, we need to figure, we're going to be in a situation perhaps for another year. We don't know. We still don't have treatment. We still don't have a vaccine. We don't have immunity. So we're going to be in this for a while. So we have to figure out a way to deal with the long-term issues of the damage. So an equity counselor is kind of like what I described, what I was doing. I was helping students to connect. It doesn't mean that I'm doing the counseling, but I'm connecting them. And that's something that I think that's an idea.
Sharon, any thoughts, sort of at an institutional level, either a policy or even maybe a mindset that needs to come into the picture?
And when, Enrique's point is so important, I think, because it really focuses our attention on the fact that we're all undergoing this pandemic, but we're not experiencing it equally to each other. And some of our populations are experiencing it in multiple difficult ways. So, for example, at Spelman, because we serve are a African-American student body. Much of our faculty are diverse themselves, drawn from the communities that are suffering the worst of the consequences of this pandemic on multiple metrics, right? So health, certainly, but also financial, just risk, psychological. All of that was true of last spring. And so when Enrique is talking about himself and his colleagues as equity counselors, it reminds me that our equity counselors also need equity counseling in the context of HBCUs. And so I think this is really important for the fall, because we really pulled it together quickly and enabled our students to get across that finish line in the spring. But the great unknown is how these student bodies of color in particular and their families are going to be situated to even make it back into our campuses, virtually campuses. In the fall, or have the disruptions of this pandemic become so severe that we are already at-risk populations are now an at-risk multiplier due to this pandemic.
Charles, thoughts about, is there something that you think sort of institutionally needs to come into the picture here to make sure that, student equity doesn't get that student equity remains kind of top priority?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to build on both what Enrique and Sharon said. And I think one of the sort of glaring, omissions of faculty training and preparation, right? We know that for many of us that attended graduate school, we didn't really learn directly about how to teach, right? You sort of take the best of what you can from faculty and create your own and stumble along the way in your early career. But this also shows that many faculty are ill prepared to deal with sort of student services as a whole, right? And so as someone who's a higher ed scholar, who's worked in student affairs, I think about all the ways that faculty are ill equipped to provide this sort of wraparound service, this equity counseling and ushering people from one space to the next, especially outside of education. So if we're thinking about consolidating resources and cross-training, what would it look like for faculty to be able to learn from student affairs professionals on their campus about how best to support students in all the ways that they need to be supported, given that we are consistently defunding student services, right? We're trying to consolidate cultural centers. And so there's even more incumbent upon faculty to actually know how to engage students based on where they are developmentally in terms of their identity, in terms of their moral and ethical development, things of that nature. And I think that is ever more important now, because the faculty member is perhaps the one person with whom students are interacting the most in this particular moment, because they're not able to interact with each other. They're not able to go to some of these service centers that have previously existed. And so what does it mean to better equip and empower faculty to be more of that holistic equity sort of version of a professional, to really think about all the outcomes that are produced for students that go to college that are beyond just what happens in the classroom?
Yes, yes.
I want to go to Allison for that question too, but before I do, you're reminding me of the thing that you and I had talked about a little bit, is like all this pressure that's coming on faculty members right now because exactly where they sit in the thing. Does it, and maybe Allison, you could talk to this too, does it require sort of a different understanding of what the expectations are for faculty members? You know, you're a new professor just starting on the tenure track. You know, there's teaching and service obligations. Should there be like a stop the clock moment here, you know, a COVID moment here where a lot of different expectations for faculty members shift and they go right, you know, and teaching becomes sort of the number one and everything else,
If I
you know,
could,
officially, it formally does.
if I could jump in on that, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, and I'm sure other institutions on the represented here had the same experience. That was one of the first things that we did was, you know, the faculty brought forward some legislation through the, you know, faculty process asking that we stop tenure clocks for a semester. And I think that that was certainly a start. I was also thinking, though, reflecting on Charles's comments, that one thing that we just announced ourselves this week as part of our, you know, ongoing efforts to think about systemic racism and the burdens placed on our own underrepresented faculty and staff was we've just announced that we're going to institute a policy to come up with a form of compensation for the informal mentoring that Black, Indigenous, and people of color faculty are always performing as kind of invisible labor on the campus. It was one of the things that was really heightened by the crisis because those were the people that students reached out to. And I couldn't agree more with Charles's point that faculty haven't typically been trained in the kinds of work that student affairs professionals do, and they really took on a lot of work. And we felt that this was a moment to recognize that and develop a system of whether it's a course release or some sort of compensation to, you know, to accommodate that. I also wanted to add that one thing that we have just started working on, a new position that predated COVID, but that we thought was important, is similar to an equity counselor, a position we call an assistant director of student support and advocacy. And that's really meant to be a kind of caseworker to work in a holistic way with students, because we found that for many students, so many kind of resource questions get mixed in with the academic challenges they're experiencing, that it's very hard for one office to sort of follow them through all of the different places that the challenges appear. And, you know, the work that Enrique described himself doing, you know, does require somebody who's willing to sort of walk through the system with them. Even as a college administrator, I have to admit our systems are opaque, and there's no reason why a student would know the difference between an academic affairs office and a student affairs office and who handles advising. Why would they know that? And so coming up with a position that's meant to be kind of the hand holder who says, let me figure out who you need to see, seemed like it would be especially helpful to students who didn't grow up with that sort of understanding of our structures.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of jump in to add that I definitely think there has to be some reconfiguration or reconstruction of what promotion and tenure look like for faculty in this particular moment. I mean, as we know, we will probably deal with this particular version of the pandemic perhaps for the next year, but the effects of this will be felt for, you know, at least a decade, right? And so I think that, you know, one consideration is the extent to which faculty have direct input on how their dossier might be evaluated given their response in this moment. Right? I can even think for myself as someone who was at some point between institutions where I was both sort of overwhelmed with what I was needing to do to close out with students who, you know, entrusted me to help support them, but also receiving emails from my new institution prior to even arriving, right, about how I could otherwise be supportive and help students navigate those particularities of their situation. And so I think it's really important that, you know, faculty senates and for the leadership of particular schools consider that PNT shouldn't just look like, at least at a, you know, major research institution, what you're able to publish, in part because we are unable to write in the same ways that we would have, right? Also not having that quiet, taking care of folks at home. But, you know, backlogs for journals are also going to be a serious problem over the next few years, or not as much will be able to be published, right? And so if teaching and service are really what is going to help institutions move through a really difficult time, then that has to be something that considers more weight than it has, particularly in the past. And I think it will also help illuminate the extent to which all faculty can't operate under the same model if we're actually supporting students who don't operate under that same model as well.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, changing a paradigm. This is big.
Yeah.
There's been a few comments in the Q&A, people talking a little bit about, how do you know if you're trying to, pare down your class, how do you know what's essential and how do you empower students? One of the questions that I have is like really getting back to that like very gut problem of connectivity. So many students right now who rely on their cell phone as their main device. Are there some things that colleges should be doing like formally to say, you know what, we have to acknowledge that students don't have the connectivity that they normally would have, and therefore certain assignments are not going to happen, certain things are just not going to happen. Does that have to come, does that have to come from the top down, or is that something that students should be addressing, case by case? It seems like it might be harder case by case. Sharon, is that something that's an institutional policy?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say it has to come top down. I saw a lot bubbling up from both, our student body immediately, where our student government was very, very active in helping to lead the conversation about pass-fail, for example, in last spring. And our faculty too, as Charles said, at Spelman, we also saw a very active faculty talking about their colleagues, particularly junior colleagues who were pre-tenure, and what was fair in an environment where they had to shift to suddenly online teachers. And so we're going to be working our way through that. But I think we really need to work our way through that in the best example of a shared governance system, and one that is attentive to the voices of our students. So I think that we're there. And one last point is that, if I had a magic wand, I would, have enough resources to hire more instructional designers who would work alongside our faculty right now. I mean, our faculty did the miraculous last spring when they shifted to online teaching in the way in which they did. But this summer, they're all engaged in trainings and intensively looking at now how do we create an excellent educational experience for our students in these various classes that we teach. And there are experts at that in today's digital world. They're called instructional designers. And if we had enough money to hire them, they would be able to stand side by side with our faculty in creating this new course delivery system.
We had a question about the library resources and how schools can think about using libraries maybe in a more creative way. Does that come in? I know that's not the same as an instructional designer, but anybody have a particular thought about the role of the library, particularly serving remote students at this point? I would imagine most libraries are not really set up to be, serving in that environment.
I would argue actually that libraries have been ahead of faculty in many ways in thinking about increasingly remote work. That they've actually recognized that students come to the library to study. They don't necessarily come there to use the resources of the library in that moment. They do that from all kinds of different times and spaces. So our library did a great job of being on top of all of the kinds of training and support they would normally have. And they kept reminding us that the library is open. The building is closed, but the library is open. And they maintained that. I wanted to add too, although we haven't had a chance to talk much about disability services and support for students with learning disabilities. That was a really important cohort that was really disadvantaged in the shift to remote instruction, and many offices in the college reached out to be helpful, but especially the library in making sure students could access alternative services, making sure that they could see multiple formats for reading materials and handling things. We're great players there too.
I want to also get back to one issue that several of you raised early on, is just this, this social capital that students develop when they're on campus, particularly students who aren't typically, you know, underrepresented students in colleges. When they come to campus, they sort of develop these networks. What can colleges do to help foster some of that social capital development in an environment when students are really just, you know, even the connections with the professor are not going to get them that far. They're going to help them with the classroom maybe, but they're not going to sort of help them in this other side of the thing. Thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Oh, Enrique, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I believe now more than ever, we need to really work together with the clubs and organizations, the student-led organizations, the identity-based organizations, the affinity groups, whatever terms that people use, because they create a space outside, and oftentimes they're not codified or codified in the structure of the campus, but there is a sort of like a second life to the campus life, and it revolves around the student life, and these students exactly. So you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know, kind of thing. And so for many first generation students, people of color, working class students, that's where you plug in, right? So the campus is where you plug in and you get to know people. And why is it important to know people? Why? Because we know, the research shows that if you work on campus, if you're part of a student organization on campus, you're more likely to make it across the finish line. You're more likely to graduate. Why? Because you're plugging into something. And so when we think of the curriculum, oftentimes we make the mistake of just thinking about what takes place in the classroom. But really, the curriculum is the whole experience of the student. It's going to go have lunch with your friends. It's the parking situation. It's going to the library. It's so the curriculum is everything that takes place. And so we struggle with, currently we struggle, and then now with the whole pandemic. So equity is a lot harder than access. Oftentimes, you know, we think of access, which is great, but equity really is the next level. It's like the second floor, the third floor of the building. It's a heavier lift, and it really should be the overarching aspect of every decision that we make, whether it's in the classroom or not, because the whole experience is the curriculum. And
I love the idea that great thing about the parking lot is parking is part of the curriculum. And I'll just go to everyone out to Charles right now. Any further thoughts? I know we're kind of winding down to the end of the hour here, but thoughts about ways that, you know, maybe even with connections to the curriculum, we could, you know, colleges can proactively make sure that they're building some of these, you know, opportunities that help students develop the social capital that's part of the experience?
Sure. So I think one thing, as much credit as we'd like to give to institutions for facilitating the extent to which social capital can be developed, a lot of this is done by students on their own, right? And we see this in so many different ways. I think one of the things that's instructive about what community colleges have done for a really long time and other commuter institutions is being able to leverage and use social media to help create sense of community both before and while students are enrolled, right? And so I think that if we can go where students already are, which are the Twitter, the TikToks, the Facebooks, and so forth and so on, then we have an opportunity to engage with the students, help them engage with each other just by being able to put them in similar and shared space. Now, we do need to monitor those spaces and keep an eye on things that happen that are not so good, just like I mentioned with Zoom bombing. But, you know, in some regards, institutions kind of just have to get out of the way and empower students who are already doing this work, right? Whether that's through having a compensated position or a student work, you know, position that allows that facilitation to take place. But again, they're establishing the group needs, right, already. They're establishing the smaller Facebook groups for entering freshman classes. And so really it's maybe listening to students about what they're already doing and amplifying that through the various communications we already have, like newsletters or, you know, department announcements or things of that nature that allow students to get engaged just by clicking a link, going to a space where they're already going to be, and then sort of self-organizing as they always do within their affinity groups.
But not Facebook anymore, because that's just for old people, right? Yeah.
Well, if we look at the data though, right, if we look at the data, we know that many racially minoritized students actually are above traditional age, and more of them are 24 to 35, right? And so many of those folks are still actually using Facebook, especially in our two-year sector. So no, definitely not your traditional entering freshmen. They, I think, don't want to be on Facebook whatsoever, but we do have a lot of folks that are still in that space.
That's an interesting point. We had a question earlier about the students who will be coming back, maybe as first-time students to community colleges, and what are some ways to sort of acclimate those students, some of them who may be new to college for the very first time. And I guess what you're saying is take Facebook or take technologies and things that people are already comfortable with and build off of that, right?
Absolutely.
Sharon, thoughts on sort of this social capital level issue, both for the traditional age student and for the older student?
Yeah, and I would just say, just to add, that there is no question that the peer-to-peer relationships and the peer-to-peer support is such an important part of retention, success, and at Spelman, we call it the Spelman Sisterhood, and it is something that our students take with them for the rest of their lives. It's their way of connecting with the broader alumni network, and it's a way for them to be plugged in, as Enrique said earlier, to their multifaceted educational experience. So it's going to be critical for us to be able to create virtual opportunities for our students, particularly the first years, who are just joining this renowned Spelman sisterhood.
Great. Allison, you get the last word on this, because I think we're sort of winding down our time here. But
sure, and I'll try and be brief. I agree with Charles that students don't want social engineering from institutions, but I think actually this moment is a particularly good one for building on those natural connections, because if you look at the energy around social justice and Black Lives Matter and sexual violence and the issues that students are very engaged in talking about on social media, those are all things where they're looking to the institution to either make change or partner or do something better than we're currently doing. And there's a lot of activity there. And I think that actually represents one of the ways in which you see students kind of organically saying, where is the kind of outside the school curriculum? What is the thing I want to be engaged in and learning about that I can join other students in? So I think if we can find ways to sort of subtly and positively connect with that, not getting in their way, not taking charge of it as the grown-ups, but connect with that, we might be able to get out of the way in a positive sense and help students see those opportunities for social change as integrally connected to what we can offer them as an institution.
It's a really good point, and I said you were going to get the last word, but I'm actually going to go to Sharon for the last word, because something she talked to me about early on was just thinking a little bit about how, especially the events of the last few months have been traumatic for both for students and for faculty members. Everybody's really feeling this pain right now in our country. You're at an HBCU that's got a long tradition of student activism. Are there, how does an institution sort of, as we wind down, how does an institution sort of think about its role in balancing, the concerns, the faculty members are feeling these same issues, their students are feeling them, and now, suddenly everything's kind of come together in a remote environment. How do you build something around that?
Yeah, so we know that our college campuses would normally, in normal times, be the sites for an enormous amount of student activism in a time like this, right? So if our campuses were open for business and our students were physically able to be on our campuses, we know that what that would look like. At Spelman, our students were really central to players, activists in the civil rights era, and there's every reason to believe with the death of George Floyd, the increased, maybe transformational embrace of the Black Lives Matter moment, that our students would be on the forefront of that and supported and encouraged by our faculty. So my feeling is that the COVID pandemic has in some way taken that ability away from our students right now. And so we will have to be attentive to creating opportunities for them to be the voices that we know that the young have always been in transformative moments like this in American history.
Great. I wish we could go on all afternoon, but I know we can't do that. And so let me just thank all of you, Enrique, Allison, Charles, and Sharon, for being part of this conversation. It was really stimulating for me, and I hope for the folks who are paying attention here, listening in. Also want to thank Microsoft for sponsoring events like this event and others like it. We can't do these events without this kind of support, so we're really grateful for that. Please keep in touch with us here at the Chronicle. I think some of the speakers put their contact information in the chat there. Really want to thank you all for joining, and if you hope you all continue to check in with me also at the Chronicle. I write a weekly newsletter called The Edge, where I write about lately it's a lot about COVID-19, but it's also about ideas changing higher education. And as I generally like to sign off that newsletter with the same thought I leave you all with today. Hope you're all please staying safe, sane, and humane. And good luck, and we'll see you all soon in the future forum. Thanks again, panelists. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Goldie.